Normally I read the passage that we're going to look at and then we dive into it, but this morning we're going to do it a little bit differently. We'll begin to walk through this psalm, and we will read it as we go along through the first section. But the overall thought of it, Psalm 105, is really this. It is celebrating God's providential care. And I just, for my own soul this last week, is just a fun time of just thinking on God and His providence. And also thinking on worship. It's one of the great things. There was a brother some years ago, and he really decided to do that. He would lead in worship in church on a regular basis, and he said, I really want to understand what true worship is to be like. And so he said, I just started reading through the Psalms to just try and understand what it should look like and what is the kind of worship that should honor God. And it's interesting because there's so much we can learn from the Psalter. And there's so much we can learn from Psalm 105. And this is one of my favorite Psalms. When I taught Old Testament survey, I would suggest that everyone read through the Psalm because it's basically a great summary of the first part of God's dealing with the nation of Israel, bring them all the way into the promised land. And we'll see that as we walk through this psalm, but there's just so much great stuff here, and we don't have time to cover everything. Just for a point of observation for you, notice on Psalm 104, the very end, notice the last line, verse 35 of Psalm 104, praise the Lord. It's interesting that if you notice Psalm 105, same thing, at the end of verse 45, praise the Lord, hallelujah. And then we have Psalm 106 begins with this particular phrase, praise the Lord. The other thing that's interesting is that if you look at Psalms 105, the first verse, we have this declaration, oh, give thanks to the Lord. Verse 1 of 106, the second line, oh, give thanks to the Lord. In 107, if you will, the first line of verse 1, oh, give thanks to the Lord. And even if you read Psalm 106 and 107, they begin with the exact same wording, oh, give thanks to the Lord, for His loving kindness is everlasting. There's so many different links that tie all of these together. And really Psalms 104, 105, and 106 are also tied together by the content of what is there. What's interesting is if you read Psalm 104, it is sovereignty of God in relation to His creation and His provision for His creation universally. When you look at Psalm 105, we'll see that God is providentially caring for His people specifically. And then in Psalm 106, we see that care for God and His deliverance for them, but we also see Israel's rebelliousness in Psalm 106. And so there's so many things that tie all of these things together, and we can't spend time belaboring every moment. These are just things I point out to you for your own personal reading to go back and look at them. But there's so much here to understand as far as how to worship God. If you go with me to Psalm 105, several things that's very interesting. When we talk about true worship, it should involve the entirety of our being. So often I think sometimes we can come with just the mouth, the heart's not there. Right? Or we can mouth the words and our mind just isn't really on what we're singing about. This is why sometimes I like doing songs a cappella, because you really get to spend your attention focusing on the words that are coming out of your mouth. And really evaluating, do you really mean what you're singing to God, or are you just going through the motions? Because this is what we typically do on Sunday. It's interesting that if you look at this psalm, it's very fascinating because we have the involvement of the tongue. The tongue is necessary. Notice with me verse 1, for giving thanks. It's necessary. Verse 2, for singing to Him and singing out praises. This we understand. We come, we sing, we do this. We use our mouths to make these declarations, to lift up God, to exalt Him, to adore Him. But the other thing that's interesting is that it also involves the heart. And this is necessary in the regards to seeking Him. Notice verse 3. Let the heart of those seek the Lord be glad. Seek the Lord and His strength. Seek His face continually. So when we talk about true worship, it's not just something we do with our mouths, and it's not just merely uttering words. It's actually coming with a heart that's ready to worship God. It's why I love Romans, because really it teaches us what true worship is. It's an issue of Sunday should be an accumulation of a whole week of worshiping God with our life. Of making known all the things that He has done for us and all the wonders that He has performed in our lives and all the amazing things that He has accomplished in and through our lives and the redemption He has provided for us. It's just the giving of thanks of all the provisions He makes. And really that's what this psalm is. It's just thanking God for His providential care. All the ways that God has provided for His people. But it also involves the mind. So we have the involvement of the tongue, we have the involvement of the heart, we also have the involvement of the mind. Notice with me verse 2 of Psalm 105. It's translated, speak of all his wonders. Could be meditate. Meditate on all his wonders. Notice verse 5. Remember his wonders which he has done. See, worship involves the entirety of our being. It involves our tongue. It involves our heart. It involves our mind. It involves the entirety of our being, coming before God and just pouring ourselves out in worship before God. And this is what we have in this Psalm 105. And it is a challenge, really. We'll come back to these first verses of Psalm 105 at the end. And really, it's a series of imperatives that are given here. But really, it's an answer to how do we respond when we talk about the fact that God is providentially caring for us. But the first thing I want to look at is the fact of God in history, or the Lord in history. And it's interesting because there is this sweep that comes through this psalm, and it really is just laying out, if you will, in broad scope, if you will, the salvation or redemption history for the nation of Israel. But there's so many truths here that are pertinent to our lives. And so I wanted to walk through this, and we'll read through this as we go through this. But first we have the period of the patriarchs. And this comes in Psalm 105, starting in verse 7 through verse 22. So follow with me as we read. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He has remembered his covenant forever, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations. The covenant which he made with Abraham and his oath to Isaac, and then he confirmed it to Jacob for a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as the portion of your inheritance. When they were only a few men in number, very few, and strangers in it, and they wandered about from nation to nation and from one kingdom to another people, he permitted no man to oppress them, and he reproved kings for their sakes. Do not touch my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm. And he called for a famine in the land, and he broke the whole staff of bread, and he sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave, and they afflicted his feet with fetters, and he himself was laid in irons, until the time that his word came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him. The king sent and released him, the ruler of the peoples, and set him free. He made him lord of the house and ruler over all of his possessions, to imprison his princes at will, that he might teach his elders wisdom. There's so much covered here. Really, we go through the inauguration of the covenant. We have the nomadic wandering that goes through the land of Canaan. We have the story of Joseph in Egypt. This covers a broad sweep, and there's a lot of years covered within this period. The other thing is the period of the Exodus. Notice with me verses 23 through 38. Israel came into Egypt, thus Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham, and he caused his people to be very fruitful, and he made them stronger than their adversaries. He turned their heart to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants. He sent Moses his servant and Aaron, whom he had chosen. They performed his wondrous acts among them and miracles in the land of Ham. He sent darkness and he made it dark, and they did not rebel against his words. He turned the waters into blood and caused their fish to die. Their land was swarmed with frogs, even the chambers of their kings. He spoke, and there came a swarm of flies and gnats in all their territory. He gave them hail for rain and flaming fire in their land. He struck down their vines, also in their fig trees, and he shattered the trees of their territory. And he spoke, and locusts came, young locusts even without number. And they ate up all vegetation of their land, and ate up the fruit of their ground. And he also struck down the firstborn in their land, the first fruits of all their vigor. Then he brought them out with silver and gold, and among his tribes there was not one who stumbled. Egypt was glad when they departed, for the dread of them had fallen upon them. We have the entering. It's interesting because this section is bracketed by them entering into Egypt and then them departing Egypt. And in the middle we have Moses and his plagues manifesting the power of God, his providential care for his people. Then we have this period of wilderness wandering that comes in verses 39 through 43. Notice with me. He spread a cloud for a covering and fire to illumine by night. They asked, and he brought quail and satisfied them with bread of heaven. He opened the rock and water flowed out, and it ran to the dry places like a river. For he remembered his holy word with Abraham his servant. And he brought forth his people with joy, his chosen ones with a joyful shout. Not only do we have covered the wilderness wanderings and God's provision for the people, but finally we find him fulfilling his covenant and bringing them into the land of conquest. Notice with me in verse 44, and he gave them also the lands of the nations, that they might take possession, the fruit of the people's labor. This really is summed up in all of the book of Joshua, but it's amazing because when you read through Psalm 105, there's such a broad sweep of so many things and so many years that are covered. And it doesn't get into all the details, but nonetheless, there's so much truth here. But what is the overriding idea that comes out of Psalm 105 for me? When you read through it, you find that God is faithful. I just rejoice today at the provision from God. He has provided so many things for us, and I find so often we fail to stop and thank Him for all of those things. Everything. I mean, there's so many things in life I think we take for granted. Or that we look to ourselves and say, man, what a great job I did. Or man, I was so wise in making that decision. Or man, I can't believe I figured everything out and I planned it this way and it turned out exactly how I planned it. Do you realize that God is behind all of that? And do we thank Him for that? The amazing thing is that the psalmist stops and reflects on the faithfulness of God. He is the promise-making God. But not only that, He keeps His promises. He starts off with the covenant to Abraham. Whatever God says He's going to do, He does. Not only that, but His ways are mysterious. It's amazing when He provides for His people when they enter into Egypt. He anticipated their needs and made a preparation for them by having Joseph there already before they even got there. And there they were going to be so numerous to where their enemies were afraid of their number. God did that. Not only that, but He is mindful of His people. No matter where they are, no matter what's going on, He always cared for them. He planned for their needs ahead of time. He always met their needs all the time, and He did this faithfully all the time. It staggers me because wilderness wanderings, right? Why were they there in the wilderness? 40 years. Was it because they were good? No. It was punishment, right? They wandered the wilderness for 40 years because of punishment. Do you know what? God was still faithful to His covenant to them. I love in Deuteronomy it says that your feet and your clothes did not even wear out. In 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, even though you were under God's punishment, they did not wear out. God still provided for His people, even though they rebelled against Him. Even here we find in Psalm 105, the mention of the provision of the quail. They asked. You read the account. They didn't ask. They complained. They were groveling at God and they were complaining to God about what He had already provided for them. They wanted more, and so God sent the quail. It wasn't because they were asking with the right heart. They complained. And God still provided. It's amazing. It's amazing how much our God cares for us, isn't it? Isn't it amazing all the different ways He makes provision for us, even to the meals that He puts upon the table on a daily basis? So I tell my kids, you put the silverware down, we do not touch our food until we thank God for this food. He put it there. And I know we can go and do our jobs and we work and we labor and we put forth all this effort. Do you understand that there is no way that we could ever do that without God? We don't even breathe without God. I can't do anything without Him. Paul says, in Him we live, move, and have our being. So how do we not then stop and thank Him for the food that He puts on the table? The basic provisions of life, we take those for granted. We take them for granted, but God has provided all of them. The roof over our head, it's a gift of God. I just tell you, house is not a part of God's salvation plan. It just isn't. It's not a part of our atonement. It's not. It's an added extra benefit in life. God didn't have to give me this house. He is gracious to do so. Like one brother said, I understand a cardboard box is shelter. It is. If that's what God provides for me, then that's what I will accept. The amazing thing is He has provided a roof and walls to house and comfort my children and to be a protection for them. But He doesn't have to do that because that's not a part of His salvation plan. But I take you to this Psalm 105. We'll start in verse 7 and following. We'll come back to the first few verses. But we first look at the fact that God promises. He promises. And it's amazing because He fulfills His promises. Notice verses 8 and 9. Over and over we have these statements in reference to the covenant. And this is a freely made commitment by God. This is not a bargain. This is not quid pro quo. This is God saying that this is the promise I am making to you, going all the way back to Genesis 12. And it's amazing, all of the covenants that flow out of that one covenant, Genesis 12, that God made with Abraham, they're all God giving His name to this. When God says, I promise to do this, understand this, God will fulfill that. It was His sovereign intention that He was going to bless Abraham, and He was going to take him from being Avram to Avraham. He was going to make him a father of nations. And many descendants were going to come from him. Cannot number the stars in the sky. This is how many generations are going to come from his family line, if you will. These are the things that I'm going to provide for you. This is something that God said I am going to give to you. He made an oath, verse 9. Notice with me, the covenant which He made with Abraham and His oath to Isaac. And really, literally, it is to cut the second part of verse 9. And this is a technical term for the inauguration of a covenant. God had made this with him. Notice in verse 10, we have this reference to the statute or the decree. This shows that it's an unchangeable commitment. And He affirmed this commitment that He made to Abraham with his descendants. Notice verse 10. Then He confirmed it to Jacob for a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant. It is eternally valid. Notice verse 8, the first line. He has remembered His covenant forever, the word which He commanded to 1,000 generations. A generation is 40. Think about that in thousands. The point is, it's eternal. This is an eternal covenant that God made with Abraham and with his descendants. Whatever God promised to do, God is going to fulfill. And He always remembers this. The interesting thing is that when you look at the promises that God made, there are so many elements to the promises that He made, but there's one that's focused on here and has to do with the land. Notice with me verse 11, saying to you, I give you the land of Canaan as the portion of your inheritance, which is interesting if you look at the end of the Psalm, verse 44, and He gave them also the lands of the nations, that they might possess the fruit of the people's labors. This was one specific element of the promise that God had made to the nation of Israel. This one element, the land, is what's focused on in Psalm 105, and it ends on that fact. And I love this because this is from Joshua, in the sense of that God is faithful to what He does. Notice verse 8, He remembered His covenant forever. God not only remembered it, but verse 44 says that He fulfilled it. He gave them the promise of the land. He brought them into the land. And Joshua, after they had come and conquered the land, these are the words from Joshua. Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. Joshua 23:14, now behold, today I am going the way of all the earth, and you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one word of all the good words which the Lord your God spoke concerning you has failed. All have been fulfilled for you. Not one of them has failed. God cannot fail. It's impossible. It's outside of His nature. Isn't that awesome about God, though? Whatever He promises us, guess what? He's going to fulfill it. The question that I ask, and I had to ask myself, do I really trust that God is going to fulfill what He says He's going to do? Do I trust His word? See, when He says to me, seek ye first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. The Gentiles worry about food and clothing and all of these things. But you seek my kingdom, my righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. Do I really trust that, though? Do I? Do I really take God at His word? Do I think that He is reliable, that He is infallible, that He cannot err, that whatever He says He will do, He will do? What about the decisions I make? Do they reflect that? And my kids, when they watch the decisions I make, do they see that reflected in those decisions? Do they see that I trust God in everything? Do they see that I walk in fact that God is a reliable God and He's a trustworthy God, that He cannot fail whatever His word says? Do they see that in what I do? Because the reality of it is that God is able. God is able. Notice verse 7 with me. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth, not some, all the earth. He holds universal sway over everything. You read the covenant that He made with Abraham in chapter 15. Go with me. We'll just read it anyway. Genesis chapter 15. We have the covenant made in Genesis chapter 12. It's reiterated twice in chapter 15 and chapter 17. Genesis chapter 15, verses 18 and following. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite and the Kenizzite and the Cadmonite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Rephaim and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Girgashite and the Jebusite. Now it's interesting because when you look at this, he's going to focus on the Amorite. Notice with me in verse 16, then the fourth generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. And he uses that name to embrace all of the peoples that were living in the land of Canaan. God says, you know what, your people, your descendants, they're going to be held captive, but then I'm going to deliver them and I'm going to bring them into this land. But it's not time yet because the sin of the Amorite is not filled up yet. You see, God couldn't make that promise to Abraham if he could not fulfill it. It's why I'm cautious with my kids. I don't make very many promises, but when I do everything to make sure I fulfill them. But I'm very cautious. I have to make sure that I know that I can fulfill that, because there's no point in making a promise if there's no way that I can fulfill it, right? Then all I'm doing is deceiving my kids. I'm telling them I'm going to do something when I know that full well I can't do that. See, God never tells you He's going to do something and not do that, and He is capable of doing that. He holds sway over everything, so therefore He can tell Abraham, I'm going to bring your descendants into this land and they're going to take over. Not only that, I'm going to free them from captivity to do so. Because I hold sway over the entire universe. The issue is, do we truly believe that about God? Notice that God protects. Not only does He make promises and fulfills them, He protects His people. Notice with me in verses 12 through 15. We have the covenant community. There are very few. Notice verse 12. And then when they were only a few men in number, very few and strangers in it. And they wandered about from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people. I love this. They were few in number and they were not stable. God promised them the land, but they were still aliens in the land. They were strangers in the land. I love this thought, sojourners, wanderers. To me, one of the greatest descriptions of the Christian life and experience is the fact that we are called sojourners. Saints, awesome. Sojourners, to me, awesome. I've been meditating on 1 Peter lately. We are sojourners and aliens. I love that because I realize the fact that I don't belong here. I don't belong here. This is not my home. And yet there's so many things, I mean, just think about it, there's so many things that we anchor ourselves down with in this lifetime. I'll just tell you, I didn't want a house. I loathe the idea of a house. When we moved back to the States, I didn't want to buy a car. I didn't want to own anything. I've always been that way. I've always been a minimalist. And I think it's just the way my parents raised me. Never was hung up on material things and really never wanted much. In earlier years, as long as I had my surfboard and a way to get to the beach, I didn't care about anything else. I didn't want a car, but God provided the car. I didn't want a house. God provided the house. And I told God, I said, okay, if this is the way we're going to go, fine. But if I stop using this house for ministry, then I walk away and leave it. I don't care about it. I really don't. My parents raised me in the reality of the fact that this is not our home. Our home is beyond here. Our home is in heaven. Our citizenship is somewhere else other than here. The problem is we find ourselves rooted here. My dad always says, whatever you own owns you. And it's the truth. I mean, you get a car, right? You got to work on it, keep it running and fix it. Before you know it, you are a slave to that master. Same thing with a house. Constantly doing repairs, keeping it up, trying to keep it going, keep it fixed. You become a slave to that master. Whatever you own can own you. I love the idea of being about being a sojourner because we're nomadic people. We're not tied down to anywhere or anything. Wherever God wants to move us, that's where we go. It's amazing because we have this reminder that comes in Hebrews. Just listen to the words. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in a land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Verse 13, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Do we live that way? Do we live as sojourners? How much do we stake ourselves down to this earth? What are the things that tie us down? I remember it was interesting because this is one woman I knew years ago in the church that we were a part of when I was a kid. And I remember, man, she was always on fire for God, always on fire for God. And she wanted to become a missionary, but man, she got so bogged down with school loans and things like that. And I'm not questioning her decisions. It was hers to do before the Lord, whatever, right? People do what they do, and we all have to make our decisions before God. The thing that was troublesome was that she and her husband, she had met her husband while at school. They got married, but by the time they finished, they had so much that they owed in school loans that they couldn't head out to the mission field till years later. They had to finish paying all that off. By that time, they had 3 kids by the time they were at the point where they could leave and go. And I just thought to myself, even at a young age, I thought, I never want to be so tied down that I cannot get up and go whenever God calls me to leave. It's between her and the Lord, but all I did was drew from that an observation from my own life and made my own conviction. I never want to be tied down to anything that I cannot just get up and walk whenever God calls me to go. Because we don't belong here. We're sojourners. We're here doing His work. We're here to evangelize. We're here to make disciples. That's what it's all about. But we get so hung up in the everyday, day-to-day stuff that we lose focus of what we are about, and that our inheritance resides beyond this realm. It's in the heavenly places. It's with God in the eternal residence. It's not here. It's not here. But we live so much for here. The amazing thing is that even though they wandered, God protected them. You know, we feel that we have to get caught up in these day-to-day things, right? Because we feel like we have to take care of ourselves. We need to provide for ourselves. And that's not to say we don't get out and do our job, but we have to recognize the fact that God will care for us. He does care for us. God protected them, few in number. Notice with me, verse 14 and following. He permitted no man to oppress them, and He reproved kings for their sakes. I mean, even when Abraham lied to Pharaoh about Sarah, right? God still protected him, right? He brought plagues on Pharaoh, and he gave Sarah back to Abraham. They said, hey, you go, man, just leave. Abimelech, same thing. Even though you think that there's no way that Abraham deserved the goodwill of God, God still protected him, even though he lied. I rebuked kings because of them. Because God made a promise. You're my people, I will care for you. Do we believe that? Do we truly believe that God will take care of us no matter what? Even when we fail Him. The Lord prepares, verses 16 through 22. I love this. Not only does the Lord hold sway over the entire universe, this is one aspect in which He reflects that. Notice verse 16. And He called for a famine upon the land, and He broke the whole staff of bread. You understand, God controls everything. He has providence over everything. 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 He can make these promises about the land. He can fulfill that, bring them in. He controls life. Notice with me. If you go down in the chapter, when the people are in the land of Egypt, God's going to cause them to flourish. Notice with me, verse 24. And He caused His people to be very fruitful, and He made them stronger than their adversaries. God opened the wombs of these women, and they began to produce children. God said He was going to make them a great nation. That's exactly what He did. God is in control of life. He did this. He caused His people to be very fruitful. Notice what happens. He's also the taker of life. Notice with me when He sends the plagues upon the land, the last one that comes. Verse 36, he also struck down all the firstborn in their land, the first fruit of all their vigor. He also struck down all the firstborn in the land. God has providence over everything and over nature and everything that happens. And he is the one, verse 16, he is the one who called for famine upon the land. He is the one who broke the whole staff of bread. And we might ask, well, why were the necessities of life withdrawn from these people? Why did he do that? Why would he take away this necessity of food from his people? Understand, he still sits on the throne. He is the one who controls it all. And he wants his people to understand that fact. I am the sovereign God. I have providence over all things. And not only that, I've already made provision for you. I have anticipated what your needs are going to be, and I have already made that providential provision for you. Notice verse 17 through 22. Notice this. He sent a man before them. Isn't that awesome? Anticipatory, providential provision. He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. He was going to use Joseph to prepare the way for his people, to provide for them. His brothers meant it for evil. God meant it for good. When you look at the whole story of Joseph, he was God's man in God's place at God's time. And we could look at verse 18. Notice with me, they afflicted his feet with feathers. He himself was laid in irons. All of this is under God's control. Even the abuse that he suffered. And we could ask ourselves, why did that happen? It's all a part of God working out his plan. He's working according to his eternal wisdom to fulfill his word. Notice verse 19. Until the time that his word came to pass, the word of the Lord tested him. When it was time, Joseph was going to be released, and he was going to be set in authority over all of the land, and he was going to bring about provision for his people. God's going to tell Jacob, you know what? Don't be afraid. Read the account. Don't be afraid. Go to Egypt. I'm with you. I'm there. I got you. I've already made provision for you. It's all right. You don't need to be anxious and worry. You know what's amazing in our own lives? God has already made provision for our needs before they even come. Do we realize that fact? I've been praying that God would teach me how to live autarkes, Philippians 4. Paul talks about the fact that he learned to be autarkes. He learned how to be self-sufficient. He is completely sufficient in Christ. In other words, he is not dependent on any man for anything. I'm really asking God to teach me how to be that way. I don't want to depend on anyone for anything. And that doesn't mean that God isn't going to provide for those people. But the problem is we're always looking to everybody else rather than to God. I want to find my answers in God. It's amazing because so many times in the last few months, God has just shown how he's in control. We had a chance not too long ago. We were a part of, and everyone knows, I won't talk about the ministry, but you know, $50 a month, we would go to the warehouse and you have all this food and everything else that you can choose from. And so Les and I were doing that because, you know, $50, you can go a long ways as far as food. You got to feed your family. But it's interesting because it was during a time when we were really busy, and it was a long ways for her to drive, take a day out each week to go to get food from this place and bring it home. And so we just started wondering, well, you know, maybe we should not do it for a while or something. It's interesting because at the exact same time we started wondering, you know, maybe we shouldn't do this, but at the same time it's really the only thing we could afford to do. At the same time, God opened up the door for us to support some missionaries. And we said, okay, God's opened the door, let's walk through that. So we took that $50 and that's what we did. We divided up and we put it to support 2 missionaries, 2 different parts of the world. Now, it's interesting because I know we probably have all made these decisions. And listen to me, this is not talking about me. I'm glorying in God. That's what I'm just doing here. But it's interesting because we had this opportunity to do. But you know, we sit back and we go, well, then what are we going to do for food? Because that's the food, the $50. So what are we going to do if we don't have that? But we sat and we prayed and we realized, you know what, but God's opening a door and it's all about ministry for us. And so therefore, we're going to put this into ministry and we're going to trust that God's going to provide. Seek ye first his kingdom, his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. So we did. You know, the amazing thing is, and even during that time, there is someone who had supported us for a while, pulled back their support. But in that time, there has not yet been one time where there was not a meal on our table. Not once. Not once. It may be a bowl of broth with some veggies in it, but not once has there not been a meal on our table. God always provides. Someone just sent us this envelope through my parents. It's interesting because this lady had been carrying around this envelope with some money in it for a year. For a year. And we were at a tough spot. We're going, God, don't know what's going to happen. You know we have this need. And all of a sudden, here's this lady, has this in her purse for a year, and she comes to my father and says, oh, I forgot. I've had this for Stephen Lesson. I forgot to give it to him. I've had it for a year. Could you pass this on to them? Right when we needed it. Right when we needed it. Just before that, 2 years it took Galpin Ford to find us. They had a check for $80. 2 years it took for that check to find us. We were down to our last $20 in the account, and it was already spent because it was going to pay a bill. We're sitting there wondering what in the world is going to happen. 2 years, and it finally found us. We probably would have earlier gone, God, this is the time to bring it if you're going to bring it. God makes provisions before the needs are already in our minds. We don't even know that they're there. God already has made that provision for them. Is He not an amazing God? God providentially cares for each one of us. I mean, I was just thinking about when we got married. Didn't have a thing. I didn't know if I was going to return to my job. I'm getting married. I'm still in seminary. It's $10,000 to go through seminary. Each year I have to come up with this money. And I'm getting married and I have nothing. I mean, my parents gave us a loft in their house, so they said, okay, you guys can live up there. We didn't have a bed. We didn't have a couch. Even a chair. At least we had a toilet and a shower. That's what we had. Nothing. Nothing. Within 2 weeks, the whole room was furnished. We had a bed, we had a table, we had chairs, we had a couch, we had a TV, we had a coffee table. We had things we didn't even use or need, but God provided them. And we didn't ask a soul for that. We got married, and I'm thinking, all right, well, someone had said, well, you can use our cabin up in Big Bear. And we thought, great, but how are we going to get there? I had a jar full of change that I had saved up. That was our gas money to get there and back, and for whatever we were going to eat while we were gone. I said, all right, God, I'm just going to trust you. Do you know by the time we left that wedding, we had enough money to survive for the next 2 months on groceries and everything else? Do we truly believe that God has providential control over everything in this world? And that He cares for us? And that He will make provision for us? We just have to focus on His business. You know what? If we take care of His business, He'll take care of ours. He will. I started the business to get my way through seminary. I went out for hours passing out flyers. You know, one of the jobs I got was from my laborers passing out flyers. I don't even know where they came from. I don't even know how I got those accounts. I don't even know how I paid off seminary. When I finished after 4 years, I had $2.95. I don't know how God did that. Because we had to live off every single dime that we made. I didn't even have my taxes at the end of the year, but God still provided for those taxes. Even when Les left her job so she could do ministry, God still provided. Listen to me, I'm not glorying in us, I'm glorying in God. God did this. These are the wonders of our God. And I know that if we all sat down, we could tell of such accounts in our own lives how God has provided. God not only promises, He protects, He prepares, He also redeems. I love this. Notice with me verses 23 through 38. Israel also came into Egypt, thus Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham, and he caused his people to be very fruitful. And He made them stronger than their adversaries. Notice what God did, verse 25. He turned their heart to hate His people, to deal craftily with His servants. Why? Because He was going to use them to manifest His power. He was going to show Pharaoh, the Egyptians, and the nation of Israel that He is the God. Notice what He does. So He sends Moses, His servant, and Aaron, verse 26. And they performed His wonders, and acts among them. and miracles in the land of Ham. And he sent darkness, and he made it dark. And they did not rebel against his words, and he turned the waters into blood. He caused their fish to die, their land to swarm with frogs, even the chambers of their kings he spoke. I mean, here are these rulers who think they control everything, and God sends them into their own chambers to show them that he is the one who controls all things. I am the king, not you. Notice with me, verse 31, he spoke, and there came a swarm of flies, gnats in all their territory. He gave them hail for rain and flaming fire from the... I mean, hail for rain. Come on. This is amazing stuff that God did. It was the finger of God, we're told. He is the one who redeems. Notice verse 37. He brought them out with silver and gold, and among these tribes there was not one of them who stumbled. Egypt was glad when they departed, for the dread of them had fallen upon them. Man, we're glad to see these people go. This is God. God brought them into the land of Egypt. He multiplied them, and then he delivered them. All because he promised to do that. And he did it in such an amazing way so that everyone would know. You know, by the time they get to the land of Canaan, they already heard about what God did in Egypt. The story went ahead of them. Hearts were already prepared ahead of time. People were already afraid of the nation of Israel before they even showed up because of what God did. The Lord provides. Notice all the things he provided for them. Verse 37, he provided the material and physical needs. Then they brought out with them silver and gold, and among his tribes there was not one who stumbled. They went and they plundered the Egyptians. They went to their neighbors, and the neighbors gave them silver and gold and loaded them up and said, here, get out of our land, please go. Before that, they were making bricks. When they left, they were wealthy. God did this for them. Notice that he provided for their guidance and safety, verse 39. And he spread a cloud for covering and fire to illumine by night. God didn't leave them unattended when he brought them out of the land. Notice this in Exodus 13:21. And the Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day and led them on the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. And he did not take away the pillar of the cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. Exodus 14:19, the angel of God who had been going before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them. There was protection. There was guidance. God is providentially in control of everything. He provided for their need of food, verse 40. And they asked, and he brought quail. He satisfied them with the bread of heaven. Seriously. It's amazing to me the way that God can provide. It's not amazing to me that he provides. It's amazing to me how he provides. He sent them food from heaven. There's no way they would have managed it. This is how we're going to eat when we're out in the wilderness. There's nothing out there. 2 million people in the wilderness. How are they going to eat? A few lizards maybe. Maybe we find a herd of something traveling through. No, God sends them food from heaven. Heaven. $80 from Galpin Ford, wouldn't even imagine it, but God sends it. You see, we think we've got it all figured out. We figure out where things are going to come from. We have no idea where they're going to come from. It's amazing the way that God provides for us. Do we stop and thank him for that, though? He provided water. From where? He opened a rock. He opened a rock and it flowed like a river. A rock. I mean, we hear these stories in Sunday school and we just go by them, but we just miss the punch. From a rock. The last place you would think water would come from, God sent it from there. He promised. He promised. Do we trust him? Do we trust that we can live as sojourners and aliens and know that he will take care of us, his people? No matter what. Whether it's material, physical needs, whether it's guidance, whether it's food, whether it's water, whatever it is, do we trust that he will provide that? How do we respond quickly? When we look at the fact that God is faithful to his word, how do we respond? First, we respond with praise. First few verses of Psalm 105, we go back to the beginning. Notice how it begins. Oh, give thanks to the Lord. Call upon His name. Sing. Sing praises to Him. You see, this is what should issue forth on Sunday mornings. Is all those times that God cared for us during the week. That is what should motivate our worship. We should be so zoned in on God come Sunday morning because of everything else that He has done for us, and we've been the whole week thanking and singing to Him, that when we come on Sunday, it's just an overwhelming accumulation of all of that that's happened throughout the week. All of the provisions He's made for us. Everything. Clothes on our back, food on the table, roof over our head, car to drive. We ought to glory in Him. Glory in His name. Let the heart of those who seek the Lord be glad. Got to lift His name on high. We need to proclaim it though too. Notice this. Verse 1. Make known His deeds among the peoples. We just share this with everybody. We can tell God how awesome He is. That's what I love about the Psalms. It's just praising God and His nature and His being and all that manifests from that. We just tell people, man. Tell people what God has done for you. I still appreciate that day, and I think about it often, and it keeps me minded. My wife did it. We went to soccer practice, and one of the moms asked Les, how are you doing? Because she knew that we were going through tough times. Les had just another miscarriage. She says, you know what? God has been so good. You see, the things of God should be so ready on our lips that when we are asked, we're ready to respond. Let me tell you about how awesome my God is. Let me tell you about what He's done in my life. Let me tell you about His miraculous wonders that He has performed. He needs to be pursued. I love this, verses 3 and 4. Let the heart of those seek the Lord be glad. Seek the Lord and His strength. Seek His face continually. We need to be pursuing the Lord, and we know where to find Him. We want to respond to the world and life with a Christian worldview. There's only one place where we seek His face. There's only one place we come to know Him. It's right here. That's why I love going to the Psalms, to reflect on who God is, because that enables me to respond to life. When I know my God, I know how to respond to things in life, right? Not only that, but we need to obey Him. It's interesting how this psalm ends. All of that God has done, verse 45, so that they might keep His statutes and observe His laws. Praise the Lord. You see, worship is nothing if it just comes from the mouth. It needs to also come from our life. We need to celebrate God not only with our lips, but also with our life and how we live. Twice He says they are to keep my statutes and they are to observe my laws. And look, it's not a tit for tat, but I just have to ask the question, if God does all that He does for us, doesn't He deserve at least that much? And I ask that not of your life. I'm asking it in my own life. I'm asking it out loud. If God does all that He does for me, is it not enough then that I just should respond with obedience to His word? How do you respond? How do you respond to God's providential care in your life? Prayerfully, we respond like we're supposed to from Psalm 105. I just ask that we go from today and just recognize God and just thank Him for all the ways that He cares for us, all the ways that He has been faithful to His promise. You realize that covenant He made with Abraham all the way back then, we are partakers of that covenant now. We have been blessed because God gave His word. And He is asking for our life. Can we surrender it? Whether it's the tongue, in praising and giving testimony, whether it's the heart and seeking after Him, whether it's the mind, giving it to meditation and remembrance, whether it's the whole of our life of walking in His statutes and laws, can we not respond with, I want to worship God and to celebrate His providential care by giving Him myself? May God help us to understand just how amazing God is, and may we walk in light of the fact of who He is. Let's pray.